Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the press briefing of the State Council Information Office. And today we're going to brief you about the economic performance in April. We have with us Mr. Fu Linghui, spokesperson from the Department of Comprehensive Statistics of the National Bureau of Statistics. And Mr. Fu will give us a summary about our economic performance between January and April, and in particular, April. Dear friends from the media, good morning. Before we kick off the Q&A session, let me give you a latest update. We are facing increased pressure of economic downturns since the beginning of this year because of sophisticated international situations and also the heavy blow from the COVID-19. We are facing increasing pressure of economic downturn, facing with this sophisticated situation under the strong leadership of the CPC Central Committee with President Xi Jinping at its core. Different localities and departments at different levels have followed through the decisions of the CPC Central Committee and the State Council. We have overcome the difficulties brought by COVID-19. Investment has dramatically expanded, market price has been stabilized, and the overall supply has been very steady. The overall situation of economic and social development has been maintained stable. And with the progress made, our national economy is expected to recover. One, industrial growth has slowed. Between January and April, the added value of industrial enterprises above designated sizes were down by 0.5%. Mining increased by 10.4%, manufacturing up by 3.2%, heating, gas, and water supply increased by 5%. High-tech enterprise increased by 11.5% year-on-year. By economic sectors, the added value of state-owned enterprises increased by 3.1%, joint stock companies increased by 5.8%, foreign invested enterprises dropped by 2.8%, private sector increased by 5.1%, and by product category, coal and non-ferrous metal increased by 10.5% and 0.7% respectively. Electric vehicles, solar panels, mobile communication bases, and electronic products increased by 112.7%, 27.5%, and 25% respectively. In April, the gross margin of the added value for industry went down by 0.9%. Mining dropped by 4.6%. Gas, heating, and water supply increased by 1.5%. High-tech enterprises increased by 1.4%. In April, the purchasing manager index increased by 1.4%, and it stood at 53.3%. From January to April, the total profit of industries above designated sizes exceeded more than 1 trillion yuan, up by 8.5%. For the tertiary industry, it's increased by 1.1%. This is shrunk by 0.3% compared to the period between January and March. In April, the service sector index dropped by 6.1%. Information communications, software, and financial sector index up by 3.5% between January and March. The profit of the service sector increased by 40%. The business expectation index stood at 53%. Telecommunications, broadcasting, internet, software, and IT index is still expanding. 3. Market sales has shrinked, but online sales has expanded. Between January and April, total social retail sales increased by 1.2 trillion RMB, and the size has been shrunk by 0.2%. Rural retails reached 1.8 trillion yuan, up by 1.4%. By sectors, commodities reached 12 trillion yuan. Beverage was down by 5.1%, and basic commodities saw rapid growth. Beverage, food and oil, and drug commodities at the level of county and above saw a growth of 8.5 to 9.8% of increase. The social retails of commodities online increased by 5.2%, and this accounts for 23.8% of the total social retails. In April, total retails reached more than 2 trillion RMB, and the commodity retails dropped by 9.7%, and the restaurant business reached more than 27 billion yuan, dropped by 37%. High-tech and social investment continued to expand dramatically between January and April. Agricultural investment reached 15.3%. And by sectors, infrastructure increased by 6.5%, manufacturing increased by 12.2%, real estate development dropped by 2.7%. The total area of real estate sold dropped by 20.9% year-on-year, and total revenue of house sales dropped by 35.5% year-on-year. Investment in the first industry increased, and the tertiary industry investment increased by 40.3%, and the private sector investment increased by 5.3%. High-tech manufacturing and services increased by 25.9% and 15.2% respectively. Electronic and medical devices and meters increased by 28.9%, and for high-tech enterprises, the commercialization rate of the enterprises increased by 11.9%. In the social sector, the increase was 11.4%, and its goal of which education increased by 7.9%. In April, the overall month-to-month drop of social investment was 0.8%. Between January and April, total imports of goods reached more than 12.59 trillion yuan, up by 7.9%. Exports increased by 10.3%, and imports reached more than 5.6 trillion RMB, increased by 5.0%. The commodity of general goods accounts for 56.6% of the total foreign trade. Retail accounts for 48.5% of the total imports and exports, widened by 0.4 percentage points. Machinery products accounts for 57.9% of total foreign trade. Imports and exports to Belt and Road countries widened by 15.4%. 6. The registered unemployment rate has picked up, but employment has basically been maintained stable. Total added jobs was 4.06 million, and the unemployment rate stood at 5.7%. In April, the unemployment rate was 6.1%, 0.4 percentage point higher than the previous 3 months. The unemployment rate of migrant workers was 6.6%. The unemployment for people aging between 16 to 24 and 25 to 60 was 18.2% and 60.2%. The average weekly working hours of workers is 62.2 hours. Between January and April, consumer price index increased by 2.4%, and in April, the increase was 2.1%. By sectors, food and beverage, alcohol, and wine up by 1.2%, housing price up by 1.2%, daily necessities and services increased by 1.2%. Transportation and telecommunications increased by 6.5%, education and entertainment increased by 2.2%, medical services increased by 0.7%, and for other categories, it's increased by 1.7%. In the category of food and beverage, grain increased by 11%, and vegetables increased by 24%, and the price of pork dropped by 23.3%. And deducting inflation, the overall year-on-year increase was 0.9%. Between January and April, the average price of industrial products increased by 8.5% and 11.2%. In April, the average output price increased by 2.8%, and it also registered a year-on-year increase of 0.6%. In general, in April, the epidemic has dealt a heavy blow to the economy, but the impact is short-term, and this is due mainly to the reason of epidemic. The fundamentals are looking good, and the overall landscape has not changed. The overall situation of national economic and social development has not changed. As we secured the victory against COVID-19 and put in more measures, we can expect a smooth recovery of our economy. And going forward, we have to stick to the Xi Jinping thought of socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era, follow through the decisions of the CPC Central Committee and State Council, and maintain steady growth and balance COVID-19 prevention and control and economic development. And we have to contain the epidemic, develop our economy, and also step up macro control measures so as to ensure that our economy can yield at a reasonable range. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Fu. And now the floor is open for questions. And before you raise the question, please also identify yourself. First question, please. I'm with the China News Agency. From the data that you have released, the data is going down in April. And you also said that you have every reason to believe that the economy will pick up. What are the reasons backing your assessment? Thank you very much for your question. A couple of weeks ago, as you have noticed that the temperature in Beijing is increasing. But a couple of days ago, because there was a drop of the temperature, a lot of us are taking and putting on our sweaters and coats. But this week, if you look at the temperature, it's increasing. So from this, you can actually tell that there is a correlation between temperature and economic performance. But the short-term temperature change will not affect the overall performance of our economy. Well, in the same analysis, you can see that in April, because of COVID-19, our economy has suffered a heavy blow. If you just look at April, the added value of industrial enterprises above designated sizes dropped by 2.9%, and the service industry dropped by 6.1%, and total social retails dropped by 12.1%. These are mainly due to the impact of COVID-19, and those are short-term and temporary. But the overall landscape of sound economic growth has not changed. The fundamentals are maintained stable, and we still have those favorable elements and conditions in the process of containing COVID-19, and given additional measures for economic stimulus, we can maintain sound economic recovery. And China has a very large economy, and that is very resilient. And in 2021, the GDP of the economy reached 114 trillion yuan. We are ranking second in the world, and we have every reason to offset different blows to the economy. In April, our economy suffered a blow from COVID-19, but if you look at the whole country, the indexes are looking very good, and total retail sales in April reached 2.9 trillion yuan, and total foreign trade increased to 2.2 trillion yuan, and coal production reached 360 million tons. All the indexes are still looking good, and in April, the added value of industrial investment increased by 4% year-on-year, and we have a significant supply capacity, and even during COVID-19, we have maintained steady growth for a lot of the sectors, and this has laid a solid foundation for economic recovery. In terms of agriculture, as different localities strengthen their management, you can see that the spring sowing has been well conducted. In the energy sector, many forms of energy products have increased their capacities. In terms of technical industries, and different sectors have been maintained very stable. And in April, non-ferrous metals and black metals increased by 8.9% and 3.8% respectively year-on-year. Measures have been taken on the market to stabilize price, and daily necessities have a sufficient supply, and this has maintained the normal order of social life. The overall purchase of those daily necessities has been maintained stable. Food and beverage and tea and alcohol increased by 0.1% and 0.5% respectively year-on-year in April. CPI is also maintained basically stable, and in April, CPI increased by 2.1%, and this is a mild increase. Deducting food and energy, the actual CPI growth was 0.9%, and this is even lower than the last month by 0.1%. Under the COVID-19, we have seen steady growth of the high-tech industry and internet industry. The momentum of high-tech enterprises is well maintained, and in April, high-end manufacturing saw a added value increased by 1.4%, and between January and April, investment in high-tech sector increased by 22%. For the digital industry, we also saw rapid growth, and computer, telecommunications, and other equipment saw a increase of 4.9%. Information software saw an increase of 10.3% between January and April. Total online retail sales increased by 5.2% year-on-year, and green and ecologically friendly products also saw a dramatic increase. For example, solar panels increased by 20.8%. The macro control policies have been stepped up, and we can expect better economic performance. And since the beginning of this year, we have introduced a package of plans and measures, and this will play a very important role in alleviating the difficulties of enterprises and also stimulating their recovery. And according to our statistics, according to 90% of the enterprises, they believe that those policies have improved their cash flow, and 90.2% of the enterprises say that they are satisfactory with those policies. 84.5% of the enterprises say that they 84.5% of the SMEs say that they have improved their cash flows thanks to those policies, and 94.6% of the small and medium-sized enterprises say that they are satisfactory with those policies. Different localities and governments at different levels, they have been following through these policies, and the results is showing. For example, in Shanghai and in Jilin, the epidemic has been basically contained, and they are already in the process of resuming their business operation. And they are introducing a number of policies to stabilize a livelihood and to recover the economy. And in May, we can expect even better pickup of different economic indicators. And going forward, we will carefully follow through the decisions made by the CPC Central Committee and the State Council. We will step up macro control policies, make plans to stabilize our economy and ensure the security and safety of our development so as to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on our economy. Thank you. Next question, please. I'm with China Media Group. The price of international commodities has been on the rise, and in April, CPI of China registered a new high in comparison to April last year. And how would you evaluate the trend of CPI going forward? Thank you very much for your question. And since the beginning of this year, because of COVID-19 and also the Ukraine crisis, there has been a tight relationship between supply and demand. Supply chain and industrial chain, they are under tremendous pressure, and different countries are facing increasing pressure from inflation. According to the data of World Bank, the International Energy Commodity Index was 153.3%. This is a relatively high level, and non-energy index stood at 23.9%, and this is a new high for a very long time. And according to the estimates of the IMF, because of inflation, they expect that the inflation would go from 3.9% in January to 5.7% in May, and this is a new high for the inflation estimated for emerging economies. It has adjusted that figure to 8.7%. So this is the new high since the international financial crisis. The CPI in the United States has saw an increase of 8.3%, and this is a relatively high level in 40 years. In the Eurozone, the CPI has increased by 7.5%, and this is a new high since 1997. Compared to major countries in the world, our market supply is in general sufficient, and the price increase is relatively mild. And compared to the previous months, the CPI in April saw an increase of only 2.1%. Facing pressure of inflation, it's relatively difficult for us to maintain such great performance. The CPI widened in comparison to the CPI growth in previous months, and this is mainly due to the fluctuations of the oil price internationally. And in April, because of the rising price of logistics, the logistic price also saw a big pickup. And because of the international situation, the oil price has increased. And in April, gas and diesel saw an increase of 29 and 31.7% respectively. Although the CPI has increased in wider terms, but in general, our market supply is very stable and we have favorable conditions to maintain stable pricing. Number one, in terms of food, recently, despite the rising price of grain globally, the grain price in China has been basically stable, and our annual capacity is more than 1.3 trillion pounds, and this is basically stable. We have some imports, but this is mainly for structural considerations. The imports of corn and wheat will be affected by the international situation, but the impact has been minimal. So we have every reason to believe that the grain price will be maintained stable. And we also have a sufficient capacity of pork. The price of pork is going down, and going forward, we can expect a slight pickup of the pork price. We also have reason to believe in the capacity of energy supply, and we have a high weight of our gas and oil reserves. But the international situation will exert a pressure of price hikes. But bear in mind that coal still takes a big proportion of our energy mix. As we release more industrial capacities, and we can offset the pressure of price hikes of the energy sector. In April, the margin of coal price increase has shrunk against previous months. We also have sufficient supply capacity for most of the industrial sectors. We have a complete industrial framework, and our capacity for most of the industrial categories are ranking on top of the world. In April, the retail price of industries saw a mild increase, and this is mainly due to the fluctuations of diesel and gas. So this shows that the overall capacity of industrial supply is in good shape. And we are stepping up our policies in stabilizing prices, and so we can see with great confidence that the price will be continuously stabilized. Next question, please. I'm with CNBC. I have two questions. The first is regarding industrial chain, the added value of industrial enterprises above designated sizes, and also fixed asset investment. Both of these two indexes are lower than the expectations of some analysis. And what are the reasons behind that? Do we have reason to believe that we can recover those indexes within the next months or weeks as we reopen our economy, and also e-commerce and also live streaming sales? Is there any benefit from those two sectors for the pickup of the index? Thank you very much. You mainly asked about the question of consumer price index and also the influence caused by online sales through live streaming. And in April, industrial output has dropped by 2.9% month on month. Manufacturing dropped by 4.6%. So basically, when we talk about industry, it's machinery, mining, and the supply of heating and gas and water. Mining and heating and gas and water supply has increased, but manufacturing has dropped. And this is mainly caused by the drop of automaking and equipment making. In April, automaking dropped by 31.8% year on year. The Yangtze River Delta saw a drop of 14.1%. The drop in northeastern part of China stood at 16.9%. But despite this, some sectors have maintained robust growth, and they have maintained the basic support for people's livelihood. For example, energy and other basic sectors have seen steady growth. Energy is the basic element for economic growth. And in April, coal exploitation and refinery saw 17.2%, and oil exploration saw an increase of 16.2%. So the supply of daily necessities also saw an increase, and in April, food, tea, and beverage saw an increase of 10.1% and 10.5%. Fresh vegetables and frozen food also saw an increase of 10.3%. So this can well supply the day-to-day lives of our residents. High-end manufacturing also saw an increase. In April, it's increased by 4% year on year. Electronic and telecommunications saw an increase of 9.7%, and the overall landscape has not changed. So this is showing the overall trend of steady growth in general. By regions, the central and western regions are less affected by COVID-19. In April, Central China and Western China saw an increase of 4.6 and 5.6% in terms of added value for industrial enterprises above designated sites. We still face some pressures, for example, sluggish market demand, and there are still some pain points in the industrial chain and the supply chain. The profitability has been going down, and the production capacity is relatively weak. But despite all this, we have to look at the fundamentals, which is that we have a complete industrial sector, and the overall increase of added value for industrial enterprises above designated sites between January and April was 1.4%. Going forward, I believe that with the introduction of more preferential policies, we have every reason to believe that those enterprises will be recovered. Also regarding the influence of e-commerce and online sales through live streaming, in April, because of COVID-19, total social retail sales dropped by 11.1%. But in the same period, online sales saw an increase between January and April. Total retail online saw an increase of 5.2% year on year, and online sales accounts for a larger proportion of total social retails. In April, if you look at the data, necessities and the restaurant business have been severely affected. In April, commodity retails dropped by 10.7%, and restaurant revenue saw 20.7% of drop. The retail in Yangtze River Delta and in northeastern part of China saw an average drop of more than 30%. But despite this, the day-to-day life has been well supported, and relevant product categories have saw robust growth. For example, beverage has increased by 10.6%. DIY service and community-level e-commerce saw growth between January and April. Convenience stores and community-based e-commerce saw an increase of 3.6% and 8.5%. In general, in April, the drop of retail in April is mainly caused by COVID-19. As we normalize the lifestyle of the residents, we can expect a pickup of those indicators. Shanghai and Jilin, we are seeing that the epidemic is being contained. In the meantime, we're going to stabilize the overall fundamentals, and this will further improve the consuming power of our residents, and we can expect a recovery of our retail sector. And with the paper, recently a lot of the organizations globally, they are not optimistic about China reaching the target of 5.5% of GDP growth this year. And what is your comment on this? Thank you very much for your question. And China's economic performance has drawn attention from different sectors. Since this year, we have seen some difficulties in economic development, but those difficulties, they are short-term, they are temporary. If you look at the general picture, there are some favorable conditions for us to achieve our GDP target this year. Number one, we have maintained good victory against COVID-19, and this will unleash momentum to our economic development, and we put people's life and health in the first place, and we have stuck to the zero COVID case policy, and since March and April, we have withstood the biggest challenges from COVID-19 since the Wuhan outbreak. And different localities, they are initiating their efforts in recovering their industrial operation. In Shanghai, amongst the more than 9,000 industrial enterprises, more than 50% have recovered their operation. In May, logistics is picking up. The total electricity supply is also on the rise. Investment will continue play a very supportive role. And since this year, we have accelerated the pace of issuing special debt and support funds. The national subsidy budget has increased dramatically. And also because of COVID-19, some manufacturing enterprises, they have seen more difficulties, but different localities and governments at different levels, they have followed through the policies of stimulus, and they have helped a lot of enterprises to recover their operations. We also have tax reductions and tax incentives, which are playing a very important supportive role to manufacturing. And between January and April, the manufacturing industry saw a added value of 14.2%. This is much wider than the other categories. Online sales and e-shopping have played also a supportive role between January and April. In April, although the total social retail has dropped, but as we contain the outbreak of COVID-19, we will saw a steady increase of consumption. And based on the experience over the past 2 to 3 years, we know that once the epidemic is well contained, the consumption will be further unleashed going into the second half of this year, as we introduce more stimulus packages and preferential policies, as we bring COVID-19 under control, and as we shift a lot of activities online, we can expect robust growth of the retail sector. Number three, although we face pressure for export, there are favorable conditions. The international situation remains sophisticated. There are geopolitical crises, for example, in Ukraine. The world economy in general is facing increasing pressure of downturn. In April, the International Monetary Fund has adjusted its estimates of 4.4% in January to 3.6% in April. This is regarding the world economic growth in 2022. In China, we have a strong manufacturing capacity. We are quick to adapt to the changing situation outside. In the meantime, we are advancing the construction of free trade zones. This year, we are marking the first year of the implementation of RCEP. It will further unleash its potential going forward. Between January and April, total imports and exports between China and Belt and Road countries increased by 15.4%. Different fiscal and financial policies are continuing supporting the different sectors of our economy, and we are mobilizing different policy tools to stabilize and further grow our economy. And facing economic downturn pressures, different local governments are stepping up with their stimulus packages, and they will contribute to stabilizing the overall fundamentals. In general, the COVID-19 will not affect our economic fundamentals. Under the support of different policies, our national economy will recover and then will grow. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm with Red Star News. How do you comment on the social retail sales in April? And there are people struggling to purchase goods online. And is that reflected on the economic indicators in April? Is there any negative impact? And also, according to statistics, the sales of big commodities, for example, cars, has dropped. What additional measures will be taken? Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, indeed. In April, social retail sales has dropped. I already touched upon this question when I was answering questions from other journalists. In April, in general, we have saw the heavy blow from COVID-19, and that has resulted in a drop of social retail sales. But this is temporary. This is short-term. It will not change the general trend of steady growth of social retail sales in China. Entering the new development stage, the social retail sales in China has generally saw a trend of expanding scale and increased quality since 2020, and because of COVID-19, despite of COVID-19, social retail sales has been on steady rise. So this is mainly due to the innovative models of the retail business, and this shows again that China has entered a new development stage. Our GDP per capita has exceeded more than $10,000, and we have a population of 1.4 billion. We have a huge market, so the short-term shocks from COVID-19 will not change the fundamentals. Thank you. I'm with Reuters. So from April, can you make the conclusion that in April our economy has entered a cycle of going down? Have we registered a negative growth in April, and will that trend continue going forward? And can you give us additional analysis on the future trend. Exports and investment, which one do you think will be the main driver going forward? Thank you very much. Well, we can continue follow the trend of our economy in the second quarter. And in April, there is the drop, but this does not mean that in the second quarter, our economy will definitely go down. As I have mentioned earlier, in May, although we haven't obtained all the relevant data in May, but I can tell you in general, most of the indicators are picking up. The government is introducing a number of stimulus packages. I believe the second quarter will maintain a robust growth of our economy, and this is my general assessment. And also, if you look at the economic performance in the first quarter, if you look at the three major categories, I believe that they will continue the momentum of growth going into the second quarter. And investment will continue serve as the main driver for short-term recoveries and long-term economic growth. China has gone through a long period of continuous economic growth. We have achieved remarkable results in social and economic development, but you also have to be mindful that there is a gap between China and developed countries in terms of per capita terms. This also attests to the potential of the Chinese economy going forward. And since the beginning of this year, we have accelerated the issuance of a special debt and fund, and this is conducive to steady growth of investment. And also, although some of the manufacturing enterprises, they have seen some difficulties, but we are stepping up with more stimulus packages, and we can reboost the confidence of enterprises. And between January and April, manufacturing investment increased by 12.2%, and this is the fastest growing sector. And also, investment in infrastructure has maintained relatively good growth. And between January and April, investment in infrastructure increased by 2.5%. So this shows that investment will continue playing a very supportive role. And I expect that in the second quarter, our retail will pick up. Last year and this year in the first quarter, retail has contributed the most to our economic growth. I believe that retail, domestic consumption, and investment, they will continue serving as the strong support for China's economic growth. Next question, please. Thank you very much. I'm with Economic Daily. Since this year, the grain price has increased on the global market. And what is the grain output in China in general? And what is the impact from COVID-19? And how do you estimate the overall grain output this year? Thank you for your question. So this is an issue drawing wide concerns. And since this year, grain output has been on the rise, and we have favorable conditions of stabilizing grain supply. And summer grain has been on very good shape. It's in very good shape. And since last year, winter wheat has been going down, but this year, because of sound guidance policies, the winter wheat, they are in very good shape, and different localities have stepped up their support to spring wheat, and the total acre of plantation for spring wheat has expanded. And we also have very good and favorable weather conditions across the country for the plantation of spring wheat. We are also supporting this sector with more and better technologies in Jiangxi, Hunan, Guangdong, and Guangxi provinces. The spring plantation of wheat has ended because of the favorable temperature and climate. we can expect earlier harvest of spring wheat than previous years. But because of COVID-19, there has been limited mobility of different production elements. The State Council and CPC Central Committee attach great importance to this issue, and we call on different localities to do a good job in supporting agricultural production. And different localities, breaking through the pain points in the different links of our agricultural production chain so as to ensure that the spring plantation of wheat is well conducted in a smooth manner. And in Jilin, after we have lifted the lockdown, the spring plantation of wheat has been well recovered. The central government attaches great importance to grain output. We have stepped up our support. We have increased the minimum procurement price. The three staple foods are now supported by a production insurance mechanism. A one-time subsidy is issued at key areas, and since 2020, in general, the price of grain has been maintained on a relatively high level, and there is great enthusiasm of farmers planting their crops. The profitability of agriculture is also at a new high in 5 years. But in the meantime, we have to be mindful about the uncertainties brought by pest disease and the COVID-19. Any other questions? We have 2 more questions, and you go first. I'm with the Central News Agency from Taiwan. So my question is that a lot of the regions in April, they have been in lockdown, and trucks, they have suspended their business. And in April this month, and there was a notice issued by the State Council to smoothing transportation and recovering the operation of trucks. Are we seeing the result of this policy, or do we have to wait? Thank you very much for your question. We are mainly briefing the economic performance by month. And from the big data perspective, there has been some results shown, but in general, we are briefing economic growth by month. And in some of the sectors, there can be seen that those policies have generated a result. I believe that the results will become more obvious in May. I mentioned that the indicators of logistics and power supply are picking up. I believe that in May, as we put into practice different policies of breaking through the transportation sector, I believe that the indicators in May will look much better. Thank you. I'm with the Xinhua News Agency. My question is also related to investment. Because of the downturn of our economy, there's a lot of call for increasing investment. And what do you say is the role of investment on driving our economy, and where do you anticipate that our economy will grow going forward? Since this year, investment has played a crucial role in ensuring social and economic growth. Entering into the new stage, we have seen some pleasant changes. But also, you need to be mindful that China is still the largest developing country in the world, and per capita income between Chinese and people in developed countries still features a large gap. We still have the problem of imbalanced and insufficient economic growth. And there is also an imbalance between urban and rural areas, and we have weak links in education, in medicine, and also in health. All those areas entail greater investment. And China has also entered into a new stage of economic growth. We are seeing the transition of traditional industrial economies and also some online business forms, and we have to continuously step up our investment in those sectors. And also because of the rarely seen COVID-19 in 100 years and also drastic changes unseen in a long time, we have to be mindful that we need to step up investments, in particular investment in the research and development sector. Investment will not play a role in supporting short-term growth, but also adjust the economic structure and improve economic efficiency in the long run, and also improve people's livelihood. Since this year, we have introduced policies to stabilize growth and economic development, and different localities have put down measures to readjust their economic mix. I believe that those measures will play a very important role in restructuring their economy. And the fixed asset income between January and April saw an increase of 8.8%, and this is a very good sign. If you look at the manufacturing industry, the investment is developing very fastly, and China is a strong manufacturing power, and manufacturing is a key pillar of our economy. But because of the deglobalization trend, manufacturing in China has suffered a blow, and we are seeing more points of difficulties and pains in our industrial and supply chain. So we have to smooth those different and difficult links. And since this year, we have increased our support to some key sectors. For example, integrated circuits has accelerated its development, and between January and April, manufacturing investment has increased by 12.2%, and it has contributed to 14.5% of China's economic growth. High-end manufacturing increased by 25.9%, and infrastructure is also on the rise. For the infrastructure per capita inventory of infrastructure is only 20 to 30% of the developed countries. And going forward, there is also a great potential in this particular field. Since this year, key water conservation projects and key infrastructure projects in this particular field have been on a rise. Between January and April, there has been 12% of increase on water governance and management. And we also face a gap in livelihood, although there has been pleasant progress, but there are weak links in education and health. So that is why since this year, different localities have stepped up their investment in livelihood, and this has also driven our economy between January and April. Social investment increased by 14.4%. Education and health increased by 12.5% and 24.9%. In terms of the growth trend, recently some of the investments have been hindered by the COVID-19, but in general, there is a good fundamental of continued increased investment. Investment to new construction projects has increased to 28%, and proprietary investment fund has increased by 13.5%. As we efficiently fight COVID-19 and step up our macro control policies, accelerate the issuance of special debt, we can expect a greater role of investment on our economic growth. And going forward, we will continue to allow investment to play a key and crucial role. We will stabilize our macroeconomy, refine the structure of investment, improve the efficiency of investment, and advance the high-quality development of our economy. All right, thank you very much. This is the end of today's briefing.